The world of magic doesn't end with the turning of a page. Love rises and falls anew, forbidden like poison or blazing like a phoenix's flame. The heroes we thought we knew uncover their hearts once more. So step into the enchantment of emotion and welcome to a world where love is written anew. The castle of Hogwarts had never seemed quieter. Snow blanketed the towers and courtyards, softening even the ghosts' whispers. It was the winter of the 8th year, an unusual time when war-scarred students had returned not for classes alone, but for healing, rebuilding, and perhaps forgiving. Hermione Granger stood by the tall window of the library, her breath fogging the glass as she looked out over the grounds. The forbidden forest was dark against the white sky, and somewhere near the Quidditch pitch, she could see small figures moving, students laughing, throwing snow. For a moment, she let herself smile. Hogwarts felt different now. The castle carried ghosts of the past year, memories carved into its very stones. But it was alive again. Professors had returned, new rules had been made, and there was a sense, faint but real, that life was moving forward. Still, Hermione couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest. She had come back because she needed to finish what she started. Knowledge had always grounded her, and after the chaos of the war, books felt like safety. But she couldn't deny that it wasn't only the library she was hiding in. It was from people, from feelings she didn't quite know how to handle. Ron had broken things off before term started. Their romance, so long anticipated by everyone else, had withered under the light of normal life. They argued, they misunderstood, and in the end, it was Ron who said what Hermione had already known deep down, that they were better friends than anything else. She had smiled when he said it, told him she agreed, but when she was alone, the silence hurt more than she expected. It was on a grey Monday morning that Professor McGonagall announced the new Unity Project. After a year of conflict, she said, standing tall before the gathered students in the great hall, Hogwarts must once again become a place of cooperation. You will be paired, one student from each house, and together you will research, design, and present a project centered on rebuilding our world. You have 1 month. A wave of whispers filled the room. Parvati squealed that it sounded romantic. Seamus groaned that it sounded like homework disguised as punishment. Hermione, always eager for organization, perked up until she saw McGonagall's gaze land on her. "Miss Granger," McGonagall said crisply, "you will be paired with Mr. Malfoy." The hall went silent. Fawkes froze mid-air. Draco Malfoy looked up from his seat at the Slytherin table, grey eyes flicking to her in disbelief. Hermione's mouth fell open. "Professor, surely—" But McGonagall raised a hand. "This is precisely the kind of cooperation the wizarding world needs. You two will present together." Hermione sat back, heat rising to her face. Around her, whispers buzzed like bees. "Good luck with that," murmured Ginny, trying not to laugh. "Maybe he'll hex her before they finish," Seamus added, grinning. Draco Malfoy didn't grin. He pushed his chair back, gave Hermione one brief, unreadable look, and left the hall without a word. That evening, in the Gryffindor common room, Hermione was still fuming. "I don't see why everyone's acting as though this is a tragedy," she said, though her tone betrayed her frustration. "We're adults now. We can work together. I'll just keep it professional." Ginny smirked. "Professional? With Malfoy? You know he probably still thinks Muggle-borns should polish his shoes. Hermione's quills snapped. He's changed. People can change. Really? Ginny said, raising an eyebrow. Then prove it. Prove it how? Ginny's grin turned mischievous. Make him fall for you. 10 days. If you can make Draco Malfoy fall in love with you, I'll admit people can change. Hermione blinked. That's absurd. Is it? You said he's different. So? 10 days, Hermione. Win over Malfoy. Ginny leaned forward, eyes sparkling. You're clever, charming, and he's arrogant but not immune. Think of it as social experimentation. Hermione laughed. Ginny, that's ridiculous. But that night, as she lay in bed staring at the canopy above her, the idea wouldn't leave her mind. It wasn't that she wanted Draco Malfoy to fall for her. Merlin forbid. But something about the challenge stirred her stubborn streak. He was a symbol of the old world, the one she had fought so hard against. What harm could there be in showing that even someone like him could be reached with reason? And maybe a little kindness. She told herself it wasn't vanity. It was curiosity, a test of human nature. The next morning, Hermione climbed the marble staircase to the unused classroom McGonagall had assigned them. Draco was already there, leaning against a desk, arms crossed, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Granger, he said curtly. Malfoy. She dropped her books onto the table and tried to keep her voice even. Let's just get this done, shall we? He shrugged. Fine by me. The less we talk, the better. Hermione pursed her lips. That might make research difficult. I'm sure you can handle talking to yourself. She inhaled sharply, ready to snap back. But then she remembered Ginny's grin, the challenge, the absurd idea that had taken root. Instead, she smiled. Oh, you'll be surprised, Malfoy. I think we'll work just fine together. His eyes narrowed slightly, suspicious. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, she said sweetly, taking out her parchment. Just that I intend to make this project unforgettable. And as the quill scratched across the page, Hermione Granger set her plan in motion. 10 days to win over Draco Malfoy, whether she truly meant to or not. The following morning dawned pale and cold, frost crawling up the windows like silver vines. Hermione arrived at the abandoned classroom early, determined to start on their Unity project before Malfoy could make it unbearable. The air was still, heavy with dust and the faint scent of parchment. Sunlight streamed through tall arched windows, catching in the floating motes and lighting the edges of her curls like a halo. She was arranging her notes when the door creaked open. Draco Malfoy entered, as though the castle itself bowed to make room for him. His uniform was impeccable, his pale hair perfectly in place, though his expression carried the faint weariness of someone who hadn't slept well. He paused when he saw her, eyes flicking briefly to her organized piles of books. You've already started, he said flatly. Of course, Hermione replied, not looking up. We've a month to prepare a presentation that actually matters. I don't intend to waste a day. Malfoy smirked faintly, pulling out a chair with deliberate slowness. Naturally, Miss Perfect never wastes time. She met his gaze at last, her tone calm. And Mr. Malfoy never misses a chance to sneer. He said nothing, but the ghost of a grin touched his mouth before he sat down opposite her. For the first hour, they worked in tense silence. Hermione scribbled notes furiously, while Draco flipped idly through a book on post-war governance. Every so often, he made a dry comment. "Your handwriting's appalling for someone so obsessed with order," or "Do you always talk to yourself when you read?" And each time she forced herself to smile instead of snapping back. After all, she had a plan. By mid-morning, she decided to take her first small step. "Would you like some tea?" she asked suddenly. He looked at her as though she had offered him poison. "Tea?" "Yes, tea. You do drink it, don't you?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine." Hermione drew her wand and conjured 2 steaming cups, sliding one across the table toward him. He accepted it carefully, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. The contact startled them both more than it should have. "Thanks," he muttered. "You're welcome," she said, her smile faint but genuine. For the first time, silence didn't feel like a battlefield. By the end of the second day, Hermione noticed something peculiar. Whenever she made a deliberate effort to be kind, asking about his opinion on their topic or offering to fetch an extra quill, Draco's sharp edges softened. He didn't thank her, not directly, but his tone grew less cutting, his posture less defensive. Still, she couldn't tell whether it was progress or merely the calm before the storm. That night, in the common room, Ginny listened with wide eyes as Hermione recounted the day. "You gave him tea," Ginny whispered, as though Hermione had confessed a crime. "It was just tea," Hermione said firmly. "We're supposed to work together." Ginny grinned. "Oh, this is brilliant. Step 1 complete. Civil interaction. 9 days to go." Hermione rolled her eyes. "This isn't a game, Ginny." "Of course it isn't," Ginny said innocently. "But if it were, I'd say you're winning." The next few days passed in cautious rhythm. Their partnership was strange, like walking a bridge that swayed with every step. One wrong word, and it could collapse entirely. Draco surprised her. He was more thoughtful than she'd expected, often questioning her ideas in a way that wasn't cruel, but precise, analytical. When he challenged her arguments, it was with the mind of someone who cared about the truth, not just winning. Once, when she suggested they focus their presentation on the rebuilding of magical law, he paused and said quietly, "That's not really about reconciliation, though, is it? It's about control." Hermione blinked. "Then what would you suggest?" He looked out the window for a moment, as though choosing his words carefully. "Forgiveness," he said finally. "Or rather, how people pretend to forgive before they're ready." The words hung in the air between them. Hermione found herself staring at him, the sunlight glinting off his pale lashes, and she wondered what scars he still carried that made him speak like that. When she finally replied, her voice was softer than she intended. "That's a very human topic." He looked back at her then, something unreadable in his eyes. "So is guilt." That night, Hermione couldn't sleep. She kept replaying that conversation, trying to understand why it lingered. Draco Malfoy had been cruel, arrogant, and impossible for years. But now, there was something else there, something quieter. She told herself she was just being analytical. She wanted to understand him because it would help her win the challenge. That was all. The next morning, she arrived early again, determined to stay focused. But when she opened the classroom door, she found Draco already there, this time with 2 cups of tea on the table. He didn't look up from his book when she entered. "Don't make a habit of being late, Granger." She blinked, half amused, half stunned. I'm 5 minutes early. He smirked faintly. Then I'm 5 minutes earlier. She laughed despite herself, taking the tea he'd clearly conjured for her. Well, thank you. Don't mention it. For a long moment they worked quietly, sipping tea and making notes, the tension that had once filled the room replaced by something far more delicate, like the moment just before a spell takes shape. Hermione had not expected it to feel so natural. But that evening, when she passed him in the corridor and he nodded politely instead of sneering, she realized something had shifted. Students whispered as they saw it, of course. Hermione Granger walking beside Draco Malfoy, but neither of them seemed to care. And for the first time, Hermione began to wonder if she was the one being won over. The castle's great clock chimed 9, echoing through the corridors. 10 days had seemed a game, a harmless dare whispered between friends. But as night fell over Hogwarts, Hermione felt the first spark of danger, an unfamiliar flutter in her chest that no amount of logic could explain. Winning Draco Malfoy, she realized, might not be as simple as she'd thought. Because somewhere between her careful smiles and his cautious words, the game had already begun to change. Snow fell heavier now, swirling in pale ribbons past the classroom windows, muffling the sounds of the castle. Days slipped by in quiet, steady rhythm. Meetings, discussions, shared silences. Hermione and Draco worked side by side, surrounded by towers of parchment that smelled faintly of dust and ink, and something new, like possibility. Their presentation had taken shape faster than Hermione expected. She had drawn charts and outlines, and Draco, surprisingly, had refined them with meticulous precision. He never raised his voice, never insulted her intelligence, though his wit remained sharp enough to make her roll her eyes. Still, she found herself looking forward to their sessions. On the 5th day, as the snowstorm raged outside, Hermione and Draco worked long after dinner, the fire crackling low in the hearth. Shadows danced across his face, softening his usual sternness. "Do you ever miss it?" Hermione asked suddenly, her quill pausing above the parchment. "Before everything changed?" Draco looked up. "You mean before the war?" She nodded. He was quiet for a long moment. The sound of the fire filled the silence between them. "No," he said at last, voice low. "I miss being someone who didn't know what was coming, but not the person I was." Hermione studied him, the confession too honest to ignore. "That's very self-aware." He gave a small, humorless smile. "I suppose war forces everyone to grow up, some faster than others." Hermione hesitated, then asked softly, "Do you regret it?" His gaze flicked to her, sharp as glass. For a heartbeat, she thought she had gone too far. But then his shoulders lowered, and his voice came out quieter than she had ever heard it. "Every day." The fire crackled. Hermione didn't speak, didn't try to comfort him. She simply nodded, her heart heavier than before. For the first time, she saw Draco Malfoy, not as the boy who had mocked her in corridors, but as a young man burdened with too much memory. When she left that night, the snow had stopped. The castle gleamed silver in the moonlight, peaceful and ancient, as though it had seen far worse, and still forgiven those who walked its halls. The next morning, she woke to find a note tucked into her transfiguration book. The handwriting was neat, elegant, unmistakably his. "Granger, you were right about the reconciliation theme. We'll keep it. Also, you missed a citation in your notes yesterday. I corrected it. DM. Hermione stared at the parchment for a moment before laughing. He had corrected her notes. Typical Malfoy. And yet, he had agreed with her. When she entered their classroom that day, Draco was already there, organizing their papers. I got your note, she said. He looked up, pretending not to care. Good. You should double-check your references next time. Thank you for the reminder, she replied sweetly, and for the compliment hidden between the lines. He blinked. Compliment? You said I was right. Draco tilted his head, pretending to think. Merlin, I must have been half asleep. Hermione laughed, and something in the room softened again. By the 7th day, word of their strange partnership had spread throughout Hogwarts. Students whispered as they passed. Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy seen in the library together, walking to lunch side by side. Even Harry had raised an eyebrow when he spotted them near the greenhouses. Are you sure this is wise? Harry asked later, his tone cautious but not judgmental. We're working on a project, Hermione said firmly. That's all. Harry gave her a knowing look. If you say so. But the truth was, Hermione wasn't sure of anything anymore. The line between her challenge and reality had blurred. She told herself it was still an experiment, an effort to show that even Draco Malfoy could be changed by understanding. Yet each time he spoke, each time she caught the faintest flicker of amusement in his grey eyes, her heart betrayed her. That evening, when they met again, she found him standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds. It's strange, he said, without turning. I used to think this place was a prison. Now it's the only place that feels safe. Hermione moved closer. Maybe because here you get to start over. He glanced at her then, the faintest smile ghosting across his lips. Do you ever get tired of being right? Never, she said, smiling back. The air between them felt different that night. Warmer, charged, like a spell hovering on the edge of being cast. They spoke little after that, their voices low, their laughter quiet. And when she left, she caught herself thinking about him long after she climbed into bed. Ginny noticed. So, Ginny said the next morning, leaning across the breakfast table. You've got that dreamy look again. I do not, Hermione protested, nearly spilling her pumpkin juice. Oh, you do. The same one you had when you first saw Victor Crumb in 4th year. Ginny grinned wickedly. Don't tell me the challenges work in the wrong way around. Hermione scowled, but her cheeks burned. It's not like that. We're just friends, Ginny finished. You and Draco Malfoy. I'll believe it when I see it. Hermione turned away, hiding her flustered expression behind her book. Later that day, as she and Draco reviewed their notes for the upcoming presentation, he caught her staring. What? He asked, puzzled. Nothing, she said quickly, bending over her parchment. He raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Still, his lips curved in the faintest knowing smile. That night, when she packed up to leave, he spoke again, his voice unusually soft. Granger. She turned, surprised by the tone. I know you don't owe me anything, he said slowly, but I appreciate this, working with you. She blinked. You do? He nodded, eyes flicking away. It's been a long time since anyone's treated me like I wasn't, what I used to be. Her breath caught, the sincerity in his words disarming her completely. You're not that person anymore, Draco." The sound of his first name on her lips startled them both. He looked at her, truly looked, and for a moment it felt as though the walls of Hogwarts itself were holding its breath. Then he smiled faintly, a smile that reached his eyes. "Good night, Hermione." When she returned to Gryffindor Tower, she found herself unable to sleep. Her thoughts chased each other like restless birds. Ginny's teasing, Draco's quiet confession, the way his voice had softened when he'd said her name. 10 days. That was what she'd promised. 10 days to win over Draco Malfoy. But as she lay awake, listening to the wind outside the castle walls, she realized something she hadn't expected. She no longer knew who was winning whom. The 8th day dawned soft and white, the air outside so cold that even the lake had begun to freeze at its edges. Morning light slipped through the frosted windows of the great hall, scattering gold over the enchanted ceiling. Hermione stirred her porridge absently, pretending not to hear the whispers that floated around her. Draco Malfoy was sitting at the Slytherin table, but instead of his usual aloof expression, he looked almost content. Not smiling exactly, but his face lacked its usual mask. Every so often his gaze flickered toward her. It was subtle enough that most would miss it, but Hermione felt it each time, a spark she tried and failed to ignore. Ginny elbowed her. "He's looking at you again." Hermione sighed. "He's probably wondering why I haven't brought him more parchment." Ginny laughed. "Or maybe he's wondering when you'll admit you're in trouble." "I am not in trouble," Hermione said firmly. Ginny smirked. "Then why are you blushing?" Hermione's spoon clattered against her bowl. "I am not." But Ginny's laughter drowned her out. Hermione gave up, gathering her books and heading toward the door before her friend could say more. When she reached the empty corridor, she paused, pressing a hand against the cold stone wall. Her heart was pounding far too fast for a simple conversation. She took a deep breath. It was ridiculous. This was Draco Malfoy, the boy who had once called her Mudblood. Whatever fragile connection existed between them, it couldn't mean what Ginny thought it did. And yet, when she met him later that day in their classroom, the moment she saw him, something in her chest loosened. "Granger," he said with a nod. His voice held a softness that hadn't been there before. "Ready to finish this?" "As I'll ever be," she said, setting down her books. For a while they worked without speaking. Quills scratched, pages turned. The only sound was the occasional flicker of the fire. But Hermione could sense it, that quiet current that seemed to hum between them now. Finally, she broke the silence. "Draco, do you think people can really forgive?" He looked up, eyes thoughtful. "Forgive or forget?" "Forgive," she said softly. He leaned back in his chair, gaze drifting toward the firelight. "I think people can learn to stop bleeding when they think of something that once hurt them. Maybe that's what forgiveness really is." Hermione watched him for a long moment. "That sounds sad," he shrugged. "Realistic." She tilted her head. "And do you think that's happened for you?" His eyes met hers, sharp and pale and full of things unsaid. "Not yet." She swallowed, unable to look away. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with understanding neither of them dared to name. When she finally found her voice again, she said, "You've changed a lot, you know." He gave a faint smirk. "That sounds dangerously like a compliment." Take it however you want, she said, smiling despite herself. By late afternoon, their work was done. The parchment they had filled with careful research and notes felt like a quiet victory between them. Draco rolled up the scroll and tapped it lightly against the table. "It's strange," he said. "I thought this project would be unbearable, but it wasn't." Hermione raised an eyebrow. "High praise coming from you." "I'm full of surprises," he said. She laughed, and he glanced at her with something close to wonder. "You should laugh more," he said, almost without thinking. The comment caught her off guard. Her laughter faltered. "What?" "You've been serious for as long as I've known you," he said, eyes steady on hers. "It suits you, but you're different when you laugh." Her breath hitched slightly. "That's an odd observation." "Maybe," he murmured, "but true." The warmth that rose in her chest was confusing, unwelcome, and yet impossible to ignore. That evening, as she made her way to the library, her thoughts tangled like threads. This was supposed to be a game, a dare, a challenge. 10 days to prove that Draco Malfoy could be changed. But somehow, it no longer felt like her victory to claim. She was still lost in thought when a voice startled her. "Granger." Draco was standing by the library entrance, his cloak draped over his arm. "You left your quill behind." He held it out to her, the golden feather gleaming faintly in the lamplight. "Oh," she said, taking it from him. "Thank you." For a moment, neither moved. The corridor was quiet except for the faint flicker of torches. "You didn't have to bring it all the way here," she said. He shrugged. "I was on my way." "You live in the dungeons," she pointed out. "This is the opposite direction." His lips curved faintly. "Maybe I got lost." She felt her heart flutter, quick, startled. "You don't get lost." "Maybe I wanted to," he said, his voice softer now. Hermione didn't know how to answer. The air between them thickened with something fragile and dangerous, like a spell not yet spoken. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the faint scent of parchment and winter clinging to him. Then, almost too quickly, he stepped back. "Good night, Granger." Her throat felt tight. "Good night, Draco." When he turned to leave, the sound of his footsteps faded into the corridor, leaving her alone with a racing heart and a realization she wasn't ready to face. The 9th day passed in a blur. Students whispered more than ever now, inventing stories faster than Hermione could deny them. She caught bits of conversation in the corridors, her name and his woven together with curiosity and disbelief. She tried to ignore it, but that evening, when she entered their classroom, Draco's expression told her he'd heard the rumors too. "They're saying we're together," he said dryly. Hermione flushed. "Yes, well, they say all sorts of things." He leaned against the desk, studying her. "And what do you say?" She hesitated, her voice quieter than she intended. "I say it's none of their business." A slow, almost amused smile touched his lips. "So, you're not denying it?" She glared at him, trying to hide the way her pulse quickened. "You're insufferable." "I've been told." But there was warmth in his tone now, a playfulness that hadn't existed before. When she finally laughed again, he smiled. Not a smirk, but something real. As she left that night, she caught her reflection in the window. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright, and for the first time in a long while, she looked genuinely happy. 10 days, Ginny had said, and there were only 2 left. 2 days to win Draco Malfoy. But Hermione wasn't sure anymore who would win when the game was over. The 10th day crept in beneath a sky the colour of pewter, heavy with snow that promised to fall before dusk. Hogwarts seemed to hold its breath in that cold light, its corridors echoing with the faint hum of anticipation. The castle had always been alive, and now it seemed to be watching, curious perhaps about the story unfolding within its ancient walls. Hermione rose before dawn. She told herself it was to revise her notes for their presentation, but the truth pressed closer to her heart than she liked to admit. Today was the last day of the challenge, the day Ginny's ridiculous dare would come to its end. 10 days. 10 impossible, reckless days. And in that time, Draco Malfoy had changed in ways she could neither explain nor ignore. She stood by the window of her dormitory, watching the first flakes of snow tumble down, and whispered to her reflection, "You can't fall for him." Her reflection, stubborn as always, did not reply. When she reached the classroom, Draco was already there, standing by the fire, his pale hair glinting gold in the flames. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Morning," she said, setting her books down. "Morning," he replied. His voice was quiet, but something in it felt different, gentler perhaps, though he hid it well. They worked for a while in silence. Their project was nearly complete. All that remained were finishing touches, refining their argument on post-war reconciliation. Yet Hermione found it difficult to concentrate. The scratch of her quills sounded louder than usual, the air thicker, her thoughts wandering toward things she did not wish to name. At last, Draco broke the silence. "You're distracted." She glanced up, startled. "No, I'm not." He arched a brow. "Granger, you've written the same sentence 3 times. Heat crept into her cheeks. "I was thinking." "About what?" She hesitated, then said, "About forgiveness." He tilted his head. "Still trying to fix the world, are you?" "Someone has to." His lips curved slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. "You really believe it can be fixed?" Hermione met his gaze. "I have to." For a long moment he studied her, her steady eyes, the conviction in her voice. And then he said, almost softly, "Maybe you will." Their eyes met, and for one fragile heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. The fire popped in the hearth. The snow whispered against the glass. Hermione felt her pulse race, not with fear or anger, but something dangerously close to hope. Then he looked away, breaking the spell. "We should rehearse the presentation," he said briskly. "Yes," she murmured, clearing her throat. "Of course." They ran through their speech twice, maybe 3 times, though neither could focus fully. Every glance lingered too long. Every word seemed to mean something more. When the bell struck noon, Draco rolled up their parchment and said, "I think we're ready." Hermione nodded, trying to steady her voice. "It feels strange, doesn't it? Finishing." He looked at her for a moment, and in his eyes she saw the faintest flicker of something. Sadness, perhaps. "Yes," he said quietly. "It does." They left the classroom together. The corridor beyond was empty, washed in pale winter light. Hermione hesitated at the doorway, unsure why she suddenly didn't want to walk away. "Draco," she said softly. He turned, surprise flickering across his face. She had never called him that before in public. "Thank you," she said, "for trying. For this." His expression shifted, the faintest trace of emotion passing through it. Then he gave a small nod. "You're welcome, Granger." As he walked away, Hermione stood in the empty hall, her heart aching with something she couldn't name. That evening, Ginny found her in the common room, sitting by the fire, parchment in her lap and quill unmoving. "Well?" Ginny asked, settling beside her. 10 days are up. Did you win him?" Hermione stared into the flames. "I don't know." Ginny frowned. "What do you mean, you don't know?" Hermione's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I think somewhere along the way I stopped playing." For once, Ginny had no clever reply. She reached out, squeezed Hermione's hand and said quietly, "Then I hope he's worth it." The next morning, the great hall buzzed with energy. The final presentations were to be given that day, and students filled the room with nervous chatter. Hermione stood near the front, her parchment clutched tightly in her hand, her heart pounding. Draco joined her a moment later. He looked composed, as always, but there was tension in the set of his shoulders. "You ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," she replied. When Professor McGonagall called their names, they stepped forward together. The hall fell silent. Hermione drew a steadying breath and began to speak. Their project, titled Rebuilding Trust from Division to Unity, spoke not of laws or rules, but of understanding, the small human ways people could bridge what war had broken. Hermione spoke with passion, her words clear and bright as sunlight. When she finished, Draco took over seamlessly, his voice calm, deliberate and strangely moving. "For a long time," he said, "I thought reconciliation meant pretending nothing had happened. That if we buried the past deep enough, it would stop haunting us. But I've learned that true reconciliation begins with honesty, with facing what we were and choosing to be something better." The hall was utterly still. Hermione looked at him then, her chest tightening. His gaze met hers, steady and unflinching, and she knew he wasn't just speaking to the crowd. When they finished, the silence that followed was deep, then slowly broke into quiet applause. Even McGonagall's stern features softened. "Well done, both of you," she said warmly. "That was remarkable." Hermione smiled, but her pulse thundered in her ears. Draco's words still echoed in her mind. Afterward, as students drifted away, she found herself standing by the window, watching snow fall onto the frozen lake. She didn't hear Draco approach until he spoke. "You did well." "So did you," she said softly. He hesitated, then asked, "Was it true?" She turned. "What was?" "The things you said, about rebuilding, about believing people can change." Hermione met his eyes, her breath misting in the cold air. "Yes, every word." For a moment he seemed to struggle with something unsaid. Then quietly he asked, "Even me?" Her heart stumbled. She didn't look away. "Especially you." He exhaled, the faintest ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "Then maybe you've won, Granger." She smiled back, though it trembled slightly. "Maybe." They stood there in silence, the snow falling softly between them. And though neither spoke again, both understood that the game, the dare, the challenge, was over. What remained was something far more fragile and far more real. That night, Hermione dreamed of winter light and silver eyes, of words unspoken and forgiveness offered without demand. The war had ended long ago, but something new had begun. The 12th morning after their project dawned clear and blue, the snow glittering like crushed glass beneath a pale winter sun. The castle had begun to thaw. Icicles dripped lazily from the eaves, and faint mist curled along the edges of the lake. Yet inside Hogwarts, The air still hummed with the afterglow of Hermione and Draco's presentation. Students spoke of it at meals and between classes, surprised by its sincerity and by the unlikely harmony between its authors. Hermione had spent the last 2 days trying to return to normal. She told herself that the project was over, that everything between her and Draco had been part of the task. But each time she repeated it, the words sounded thinner, less convincing. He had kept his distance since that day in the Great Hall. No more morning meetings, no more quiet hours by the fire. She'd seen him once or twice across the corridor, his expression unreadable, his stride steady, but he hadn't spoken. And though she pretended it didn't matter, something deep inside her ached with the absence. On the 12th evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Hermione found herself wandering the courtyard, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The snow crunched underfoot. The towers glowed golden in the dying light. She didn't know what she was looking for. Perhaps peace, or perhaps the courage to stop pretending that her heart hadn't shifted somewhere along the way. The sound of footsteps startled her. She turned. Draco stood a few paces behind her, his silver-grey scarf fluttering in the wind. "Granger," he said quietly. "Malfoy," she replied, equally soft. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the world between them holding its breath. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how to speak," she added, managing a small smile. He gave a faint smirk. "I needed time to think." "Oh, about what?" He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "About you?" The words hung in the air like frost. Hermione's heart thudded painfully. "Me?" Draco stepped closer, his boots crunching against the snow. "That speech we gave, the things you said about rebuilding trust, about believing in people even when they've disappointed you. I keep hearing it." He exhaled sharply, as though frustrated with himself. "I didn't think anyone would ever believe that about me." Hermione swallowed hard. "I wasn't lying." "I know," he said. His eyes softened. "And that's the problem." The wind stirred her curls, tangling them around her face. "What do you mean?" He gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "You see the best in people, Hermione, even when they don't deserve it, especially when they don't deserve it. You did it with Potter, with your friends, and now with me." "Maybe I'm just stubborn," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Or maybe you're brave." The compliment caught her off guard. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She had never heard Draco Malfoy use that word, brave, without scorn. They stood there in silence, the air crisp and thin, the snow around them untouched. Finally, Hermione said softly, "You're wrong, you know. I don't see the best in everyone. I just see what's real." He frowned slightly. "And what's real about me, then?" Her breath clouded between them. "That you're trying. That you hate what you were, but don't yet know how to forgive yourself. That you want to believe there's still good in you. And there is." Draco's gaze wavered, just for a second. "You shouldn't know me this well," he murmured. "Maybe you should have stayed an enigma then," she said, with a faint, teasing smile. He almost smiled back. Too late for that. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It felt like the moment before a spell takes hold, fragile and luminous. The snow continued to fall around them, slow and deliberate, as if even nature refused to interrupt. Hermione looked up at the castle lights, golden in the dusk. It's strange, she said quietly. When the war ended, I thought everything would be easy again, that we'd all just move on. But sometimes I think the hardest part isn't fighting, it's living afterward. Draco's expression softened. You sound like you've been carrying the world on your shoulders. She gave a small laugh. Maybe I have. It's a bad habit. He studied her for a long moment. You don't have to do it alone, you know. The words were simple, but they hit her like a spell. She looked at him, really looked, and realized how much had changed in 10 days. The bitterness that once hardened his features had melted away, replaced by something steadier, quieter. He was still proud, still sharp, but beneath it all there was an ache she understood too well, the desire to be forgiven, to belong. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, as though that was enough. They stood together until the courtyard bells rang curfew. Neither wanted to move. But finally, Draco took a slow step back. "Good night, Granger." She smiled faintly. "Good night, Draco." As she turned to leave, she heard him call after her. "Hermione." She looked back. He hesitated, then said, "You said 10 days. How many has it been now?" "Too many," she said softly, her lips curving. "And not enough." He smiled then, a real smile, small but unguarded. And for the first time she realized how beautiful he could look when he stopped hiding. When she returned to the common room, Ginny was waiting for her by the fire, sprawled across an armchair with a mischievous grin. "Well," Ginny said, sitting up, "did he fall at your feet yet?" Hermione rolled her eyes, but couldn't suppress her smile. "Hardly." "Oh, come on," Ginny said. "You've been glowing for days. It's like watching a Lumos spell that refuses to fade." Hermione shook her head, though her cheeks flushed. "It's not like that." Ginny arched a brow. "Then what's it like?" Hermione stared into the flames for a long moment. "It's like finding something I didn't know I'd lost. Something quiet, honest." Ginny's grin softened into something almost tender. "Then I hope it lasts." Hermione didn't answer. She only smiled, faint and far away, as the fire crackled and the snow whispered against the windows. Outside, the night deepened, cloaking Hogwarts in silver and shadow. Somewhere in the dungeons, Draco Malfoy stood by his window, staring out at the same falling snow. His fingers rested against the glass, tracing the faint pattern of frost. He wasn't sure what he was feeling, only that it was unfamiliar, and that it frightened him less than he expected. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. And though neither of them knew it yet, the real test was only just beginning. Winter tightened its grip on Hogwarts, coating the castle in a gleaming armor of frost. Each morning, mist drifted across the grounds like a living spell, and the lake shimmered under a thin crust of ice. The world seemed hushed, waiting for something to happen. Hermione had spent the last few days pretending life had returned to normal. She studied, attended classes, and joined Harry and Ginny in the common room as though nothing had changed. But every time she saw a glimpse of pale hair at the end of a corridor, or heard that cool, familiar voice echoing through the hall, her heart stuttered in ways logic could not explain. Draco had not spoken to her since that night in the courtyard. It wasn't coldness, not really. It was distance. A polite silence that said something had shifted, and neither of them knew what to do with it. When she passed him outside the library one afternoon, he He gave her a brief nod, nothing more. But in that single glance, she felt the weight of everything unsaid between them. By the week's end, Professor McGonagall announced the winter celebration, a formal ball to mark the end of the term. The great hall would be transformed with frost charms and silver lights, music, dancing, laughter. Hermione could already feel the anticipation in the air, though it filled her with more unease than excitement. Ginny, naturally, was delighted. "It's perfect," she exclaimed that evening, sprawled across Hermione's bed, a pile of dress sketches scattered between them. "The first proper Hogwarts event since the war, and you, Hermione Granger, are going to attend looking absolutely divine." "I wasn't planning on it," Hermione said absently, marking a line in her book. Ginny gasped dramatically. "Not planning? Hermione, you can't hide in the library while everyone else is dancing. You'll go, even if I have to drag you there myself." Hermione smiled faintly. "And who exactly am I supposed to dance with? The ghosts of my essays?" Ginny's grin turned sly. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe a certain pale-haired Slytherin." Hermione's quill froze mid-sentence. "Ginny." "What? You two worked together for a month. Half the school's still talking about that speech you gave." Ginny leaned closer, lowering her voice. "And don't think I haven't noticed the way he looks at you." Hermione forced a laugh. "He doesn't look at me. He tolerates me." Ginny gave her a long, knowing look. "If that's what you want to believe." Hermione tried to focus on her parchment, but her mind betrayed her. Draco at the ball. She could imagine it too clearly. The sharp line of his suit robes, the way he would stand slightly apart from the crowd, looking both untouchable and uncertain. She pushed the image away, but later, when she lay awake, she could still see him there, alone, surrounded by laughter and light. And she knew, without understanding why, that she didn't want him to be. The evening of the ball arrived like a spell cast upon the castle. The great hall glowed with silver enchantments, the ceiling enchanted to shimmer with falling starlight. Snowflakes drifted through the air and vanished before they touched the floor. Music from an enchanted orchestra filled the air, bright and alive. Hermione stood just inside the doorway, her breath catching. She wore robes of soft blue that shimmered faintly when she moved, her curls swept back by a charm that allowed a few tendrils to frame her face. For once, she didn't feel like the bookish girl in the corner. She felt herself. "See?" Ginny whispered beside her, her own crimson gown glowing in the candlelight. "You look incredible." Hermione smiled, her cheeks warm. "You're very biased." "Biased, but right," Ginny said smugly, then nudged her. "And look who just walked in." Hermione turned and froze. Draco stood near the entrance, his robes of dark green and black fitting him like they were stitched by precision itself. His hair gleamed silver under the lights, and his expression, calm, composed, almost regal, drew glances from more than one curious onlooker. He looked entirely at ease until his eyes found hers. For a moment, the world narrowed to just them. The chatter faded, the music dimmed, and Hermione felt something stir deep inside her chest. His gaze lingered, not arrogant, not cold, but uncertain, as though he were as surprised by her as she was by him. Then he inclined his head slightly, the smallest of acknowledgements. Ginny whispered, "If you don't go talk to him, I swear I will hex you into doing it." But Hermione couldn't move. Her pulse fluttered wildly. Before she could summon her courage, someone else, a Ravenclaw she barely knew, asked her to dance. She accepted out of sheer instinct, trying to steady herself as she was led onto the floor. Draco, she noticed, did not dance. He stood near the far wall, speaking briefly to Blaise Zabini, though his eyes strayed toward her more than once. When the song ended, Hermione thanked her partner and turned toward the refreshment table, her heart still unsettled. She reached for a glass of pumpkin punch, just as another hand brushed against hers. "Careful," said a familiar voice. "Wouldn't want you spilling that all over your gown." She looked up. Draco stood beside her, faint amusement tugging at his lips. "Malfoy," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I didn't think you liked parties." "I don't," he said simply, but it seemed ungrateful not to attend. McGonagall did pair us for her little social experiment after all. Hermione smiled. "You mean the project that turned out rather well?" He gave a quiet hum of agreement. "Yes, though I suspect the professor had motives beyond academics." She raised a brow. "And what do you suspect those motives were?" His eyes glinted in the light. "Reconciliation. Between houses. Between people." Their gazes held, and Hermione felt the familiar warmth rush through her chest again, so sudden it almost hurt. "Would you like to dance?" he asked, his tone soft but formal. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes." He offered his hand. She placed hers in his, and together they stepped onto the floor. The orchestra shifted to a slower melody, strings weaving through the air like threads of moonlight. Draco's hand settled lightly at her waist. Hers rested against his shoulder. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply moved, guided by something neither could name. "You're surprisingly good at this," she said quietly. "I had lessons," he replied. "Mother insisted, said it was necessary for diplomacy." Hermione smiled. "And does this count as diplomacy?" He looked down at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something like that." They moved in slow circles beneath the enchanted ceiling, snow and starlight falling together in a silent dance of their own. Around them, laughter and music swelled, but to Hermione it felt distant, unreal. "Draco," she said softly, unsure why she spoke his name, but unable not to. He looked at her, and the faintest smile touched his lips. "You know, I think I preferred when you called me Malfoy. It sounded safer." "Safer?" "Yes." His gaze deepened. "Because when you say my name like that, it doesn't feel like a game anymore." Hermione's breath caught. The music rose, then faded into the next song. Still, neither moved away. The world might have gone on spinning around them, but for that single, fragile heartbeat, it felt as though everything, past and present, grief and forgiveness, hung suspended between them. And as they stood beneath the falling starlight, Hermione Granger realized that whatever this was, it had already become something far greater than a dare. The night of the ball lived on in Hermione's mind, like a spell that refused to fade. For days afterward, she could still feel the weight of Draco's hand against her back, still hear the soft murmur of his voice beneath the music, still see the way his eyes had darkened when she'd said his name. There had been something there, something fragile, real, and entirely unexpected. But she had said nothing. Neither had he. When the dance ended, Draco had stepped back, bowed with impeccable politeness, and murmured, "Thank you for the dance, Granger." Then, before she could respond, he had vanished into the crowd, leaving her with nothing but the echo of that look in his eyes. Now, 2 days later, Hermione sat in the library surrounded by parchment, but her mind was elsewhere. The fire crackled faintly in the corner hearth, and sunlight streamed through the enchanted glass, setting dust motes dancing like tiny golden sprites. She should have been working on her arithmancy essay, yet her quill hovered motionless above the parchment. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to Draco again. His measured words, his fleeting smile, the way he seemed at once so certain and so lost. "Stop it," she muttered under her breath, pressing her fingers to her temples. "You're being ridiculous." "Talking to yourself again," said a voice behind her. She froze, then turned. Draco Malfoy stood in the aisle, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. "Do you make a habit of sneaking up on people?" she asked, recovering quickly. "Only when they're muttering my name in the library." Her cheeks flushed. "I was not—" He raised an eyebrow, the ghost of amusement flickering across his face. "Relax, Granger. I'm teasing." Hermione exhaled, forcing herself to smile. "Old habits die hard." He stepped closer, his presence unsettlingly calm. "You disappeared after the ball." "I could say the same to you," she replied. He looked away, his gaze catching on the shelves, as though the spines of old books offered answers he couldn't find elsewhere. "Crowds aren't my strength." "Nor mine," she admitted. "But for someone who doesn't like crowds, you seemed rather comfortable on the dance floor." A small, wry smile touched his lips. "That was different." Hermione tilted her head. "Different how?" His eyes met hers again, steady and unflinching. "Because it was with you." The words hit her like a pulse of magic, quiet but undeniable. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. Draco looked away first, his voice lower now. "I wanted to thank you for everything. The project, the ball, the way you—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "The way you refused to treat me like the person I used to be." Hermione felt something twist in her chest. "You're not that person anymore," she said softly. He gave a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Tell that to the rest of them." "Forget the rest of them," she said before she could stop herself. "You've changed, Draco, and whether anyone else believes it or not doesn't matter. I do." The silence that followed felt charged, like the air before lightning strikes. He studied her face as if trying to decide whether to believe her. Then, slowly, he said, "That's what terrifies me." She frowned. "Why?" "Because you shouldn't," he said simply. "You shouldn't believe in me. You shouldn't look at me the way you do. Not after what I've done." Hermione shook her head. "You can't undo the past, but you can choose what to do with what's left of it." He stared at her, and something softened in his expression. A flicker of longing, or perhaps gratitude. She couldn't tell. Then he straightened as though afraid of what might happen if he lingered. "You make it sound easy," he said quietly. "It's not," she replied. "But nothing worth doing ever is." A faint smile tugged at his mouth. "You're infuriatingly Gryffindor, you know that?" She smiled back. "I take that as a compliment." Draco laughed, a real unguarded laugh that startled her with its warmth. "I'm sure you do." For a few precious seconds, the heaviness between them lifted, but then his expression changed again, a shadow crossing his eyes. "I should go," he said abruptly. Hermione blinked. "Go? Why?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. Because if I stay, I might say something I can't take back." And before she could speak, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the corridor until the library swallowed the sound. Hermione sat frozen, staring after him. The scent of parchment and dust hung in the air, mingled now with the faint trace of something else. Citrus and smoke, the way his robes had smelled when they'd danced. When she finally gathered her things and left, the world outside the library seemed quieter than before. She walked aimlessly through the corridors, her thoughts a storm she couldn't still. Was it possible to fall for someone you were supposed to prove wrong? To care for someone you once despised? The rational part of her mind whispered no, but her heart, foolish, reckless thing, had already chosen its answer. That night, she found herself unable to sleep. The dormitory was dark, the fire burned low, and the snow outside glowed faintly in the moonlight. She sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the lake. Somewhere in the castle, a clock chimed midnight. The sound echoed through the corridors, deep and hollow. Hermione's thoughts turned to Draco again. She remembered the way he'd looked at her when he said he might say something he couldn't take back. She'd seen that look before, on Harry, on Ron, on countless faces that had lived through the war. It was the look of someone who wanted redemption, but didn't believe they deserved it. She wished she could tell him that he did, that he already was redeeming himself, not through grand gestures or apologies, but through the quiet, steady act of being better each day. But words, she knew, were easy. Trust was not. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering snow across the frozen lake. Hermione pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Somewhere deep down, she knew that whatever was unfolding between them was far from finished. It felt like the beginning of something larger, something neither of them could control. As she watched the snow swirl under the moonlight, Hermione whispered softly to herself, "It's not just 10 days anymore." And somewhere far below, in the cold stillness of the dungeons, Draco Malfoy sat at his desk, staring at an unfinished letter. The parchment before him was blank, save for one line, written in careful script. "I don't know what this is, Granger, but I can't stop thinking about it." He stared at the words for a long time before setting down his quill. Then, with a quiet sigh, he folded the parchment and slipped it into the drawer where it would remain, unread, unsent, and yet far too late to be unwritten. The snow began to melt in earnest as February stretched across the Scottish hills. Icy rivers carved winding paths through the grounds, and sunlight returned in thin, uncertain rays that caught the towers in a shimmer of gold. Spring was still far off, but hope, delicate, cautious, had begun to stir again in the bones of Hogwarts. Hermione walked the courtyard paths alone, her thoughts chasing themselves in circles. She had not seen Draco for nearly a week. Since their encounter in the library, he had vanished into the quiet corners of the castle, as though retreating behind the same walls he had worked so hard to lower. She told herself it didn't matter, that they had no reason to meet now that the project was long finished. But she could not still the restless ache in her chest. Each corridor held a memory, his dry wit, the tilt of his head when he was thinking, the unexpected warmth that had bloomed between them in the flicker of firelight. She caught herself turning corners, half expecting to see him there, leaning against the wall with that half-smile that was both a shield and a secret. Hopeless, she muttered to herself, adjusting the strap of her bag. Absolutely hopeless. But fate, it seemed, had its own timing. That afternoon, as she exited the library with an armful of books, she nearly collided with him. "Granger," he said, steadying her instinctively before stepping back. "Malfoy," she managed, her voice catching somewhere between surprise and relief. They stood awkwardly in the corridor for a moment, the silence between them stretching thin. "You've been avoiding me," Hermione said at last, more bluntly than she intended. His eyes flicked to hers, a flash of guilt crossing them before he looked away. "I needed time to think." "That's the second time you've said that." He gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "Apparently, I require a great deal of thinking." Hermione tilted her head, studying him. He looked tired, more than usual. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened, and though his posture remained composed, there was something brittle about it, as though he were barely holding something together. "You could have written," she said softly. Draco hesitated. "I did." Her heart gave a sudden lurch. "You did?" He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I didn't send it." Hermione's breath caught. "Why not?" "Because I didn't know what I was trying to say." Their eyes met, and in that gaze was everything he hadn't said. All the words trapped between pride and fear. She swallowed, her voice quiet but steady. "Then say it now." Draco looked away, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "You don't make things easy, do you?" "I never have," she said with a faint smile. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and for once the careful mask slipped. "I don't know what this is, Hermione. I only know that I think about you when I shouldn't, and that's inconvenient." Her pulse quickened. "Inconvenient?" "For both of us," he said, though his voice had softened. "You're you. Brilliant, infuriating, impossible you, and I'm someone who's trying," she finished. "Someone who's changed." Draco gave a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "You make it sound so simple." "It isn't," she said. "But it's true." He stared at her, and she could see the conflict flicker across his face, the instinct to push her away, warring with the fragile hope that she might stay. At last, he said, barely above a whisper, "You shouldn't believe in me." "I already do," she replied. Something in him broke then, not visibly, not loudly, but like ice cracking beneath the sun. His shoulders eased, his eyes softened, and the faintest trace of color rose to his cheeks. "You really are insufferable," he murmured. "I've been told," she said with a small smile. For a moment, neither spoke. The world around them seemed to fade until there was nothing but the faint hum of magic in the air, the rhythmic echo of distant footsteps, and the quiet, uneven beating of their hearts. Then Draco said, "Walk with me." They wandered through the castle's stone corridors, neither speaking much. The silence was not heavy now. It was full, companionable. When they reached the courtyard, the last of the snow was melting into shallow pools that caught the sunlight like liquid glass. Hermione paused, brushing her gloved fingers along the ancient wall. "Do you ever wonder," she said softly, "if we'll ever really be free of it? The war, the things that happened?" Draco looked out across the lake. "No, but maybe that's all right." She turned to him, curious. "All right?" He nodded. "Because it means we'll remember. And maybe remembering is the only way to make sure it never happens again." Hermione smiled faintly. That's a very un-Malfoy thing to say. He looked at her, his eyes glinting. Maybe I'm learning from you. They stopped near the frozen edge of the lake. The wind was soft, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth as the snow melted into spring. Hermione turned to him, her heart suddenly pounding. Draco! But before she could finish, he reached out and brushed a loose curl from her face. The touch was light, uncertain, as though he were half afraid she might vanish if he looked too long. You shouldn't be standing this close, he said, though he made no move to step away. Then move, she whispered. He didn't. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. His hand lingered at her cheek, his breath mingling with hers in the cold air. She could see the flicker of hesitation in his eyes, the part of him still at war with himself. Then, slowly, he leaned forward. It was not a grand, sweeping kiss like the ones in stories. It was hesitant, unsure, yet achingly real. The kind of kiss that trembled between apology and hope. Hermione felt the world fall away, her heart racing, her fingers curling into his robes as though to anchor herself in that impossible moment. When they finally pulled apart, she found herself breathless. Draco looked equally undone, his usual composure shattered entirely. Well, she whispered, her voice unsteady. That's one way to make a point. A faint, nervous smile touched his lips. I didn't mean to. I think you did. He exhaled, almost laughing, and said quietly, You have a terrible influence on me, Granger. Good, she murmured. It's about time. For a long moment they stood in silence, the cold wind weaving around them, the first notes of spring whispering through the air. Somewhere far above, an owl flew past the towers, its wings cutting through the sunlight. And though neither said it aloud, both knew the truth. The game, the challenge, the war, all of it had led to this. Something fragile and uncertain, yes, but alive. Something that neither of them had expected to find. As they turned back toward the castle, Draco's hand brushed hers, hesitant but deliberate. Hermione didn't pull away, and for the first time since the end of the war, the path ahead didn't seem divided by past and future. It was simply there, shared, open, waiting. Spring arrived at last, shy but certain. The air lost its bitter edge, and the scent of damp earth replaced the chill of snow. The first crocuses pushed through the softened ground near the greenhouses, bright splashes of colour against the grey stones. Students laughed more freely now, the heaviness that had lingered since winter beginning to lift. But for Hermione Granger, peace was a more complicated thing. Days had passed since that quiet, trembling kiss by the lake, and the world had not fallen apart, though it felt as if it had changed in ways she could not name. She and Draco had not spoken of it. They had not needed to. The memory of that moment lived between them like an unspoken spell, pulsing with quiet warmth. Still, Hermione found herself walking through her days as though she were caught between two worlds. Her friends noticed it first. "You've been distracted lately," Harry said one morning over breakfast, watching her as she buttered a piece of toast she never ate. "More than usual, I mean." "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Just thinking about exams." "Exams?" Ron snorted. "They're months away." "Preparation is never a waste of time," she retorted automatically, which only made Ginny grin. "Exams, my wand," Ginny said, leaning across the table. "You've got that look, Hermione, the same one you had before your Yule Ball date with Crumb." Hermione felt her face flush crimson. "I do not." You absolutely do, Ginny said, laughing. Who is he? Harry frowned. Wait, who is he? No one, Hermione said, grabbing her bag. I have to get to the library. She escaped before they could question her further, though she could hear Ginny's laughter following her out the door. The corridors were cool and quiet, sunlight slanting through the tall arched windows. She breathed in deeply, trying to steady her racing thoughts. It wasn't as though she and Draco were anything. They hadn't made promises, hadn't defined what existed between them. Yet every time she saw him, something inside her fluttered to life. Something that made the world sharper and softer all at once. When she entered the library, she found him sitting at their old table, as though he'd been waiting. You're late, he said, without looking up. I didn't realize we'd scheduled anything, she replied, taking the seat across from him. He smirked faintly. We always end up here around this time, don't we? Old habits. New ones, I think, she said, smiling despite herself. He glanced at her then, and for a moment his expression softened. You're right, new ones. For a while, they worked in silence, quills scratching, parchment whispering. It was an ordinary scene, but it hummed with something extraordinary, something fragile and alive beneath the surface. After a time, Draco leaned back in his chair. You know, my mother wrote to me this week. Hermione looked up, surprised. That's good, isn't it? He nodded slowly. She asked how I was doing, if I'd made any friends. I think she's just relieved I'm not hexing anyone in the corridors. Hermione smiled softly. You've come a long way from that. He gave a quiet laugh. Not far enough, perhaps. She asked about you, actually. About me? Yes. She said she read about your work at the ministry over the summer. The campaign for magical creature rights. She called you the bright girl who saved the world's conscience. Hermione blinked, warmth rising in her chest. She said that. She did. Then she asked if I'd apologized to you properly. And have you? Hermione asked, raising an eyebrow. He looked down at the parchment, his voice softer now. I'm still trying to. The words lingered between them, heavy and tender. Hermione reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. You don't have to keep apologizing, Draco. You've changed more than any apology could show. He turned his hand, catching hers in his. His thumb brushed against her knuckles, a small, deliberate motion that made her heart skip. I don't think I changed, he said quietly. I think I'm still changing. Because of you. Hermione's throat tightened. Then maybe we're both still learning. The library was nearly empty, the air warm and filled with sunlight. Outside, birds sang somewhere above the lake, their voices clear and new. Draco leaned slightly closer, his grey eyes unreadable. Tell me something, Hermione, he said softly. What? He hesitated, then asked, Why did you agree to work with me? Back when McGonagall announced it, you could have refused. She smiled faintly. Because I believe in second chances. And do you still? More than ever. He exhaled, almost smiling, and for a moment everything else, books, time, the lingering scars of war, faded. Then Madame Pince's sharp voice echoed from across the room. No touching in the library. They sprang apart instantly, both flushing as the librarian swept past. Draco coughed into his sleeve, trying and failing to hide his smirk. Hermione glared, though amusement tugged at her lips. It's not funny. Oh, "It's absolutely funny," he said, eyes gleaming. She shook her head, laughing softly. The tension broke like sunlight through a storm. When the bells signaled the end of study hour, they gathered their things and stepped into the corridor. The late afternoon light streamed in golden beams, warm and full of promise. Draco walked beside her, hands in his pockets. "I suppose this means we're both criminals now, library offenders." Hermione rolled her eyes. "A most grievous crime indeed." "Punishable by detention, no doubt," he said lightly. She gave him a sideways glance. "I wouldn't mind, so long as you were there." He stopped walking. For a moment, his expression flickered. Amusement, surprise, something deeper. "Careful, Granger. That almost sounded like flirting." "Almost?" she said, pretending to sound unimpressed. His smile deepened. "Definitely flirting." They reached the stairwell that led to the Gryffindor Tower, where they would have to part ways. Hermione hesitated at the first step. "Draco," she said softly. "Thank you." "For what?" "For letting me see who you really are." He looked at her for a long time before saying, "You're the only one who ever tried to." Hermione felt her breath catch, the weight of his words settling deep within her. He gave a small nod, then turned to leave. But halfway down the corridor, he paused and glanced back. "I'll walk you to Hogsmeade this weekend," he said casually, "if you're not too busy saving the world." Hermione smiled. "I'll make time." When he disappeared around the corner, she stood there for a while, listening to the quiet hum of the castle, the echo of his footsteps fading into the distance. Something inside her felt both light and steady, as though the ground beneath her had shifted, but in a way that made sense, like a puzzle piece finally falling into place. As she climbed the stairs to Gryffindor Tower, her heart lifted with every step. The war had taken so much: trust, innocence, faith. But in its long, winding shadow, something unexpected had grown. And though neither of them dared to name it yet, Hermione knew the truth. She had not won Draco Malfoy in 10 days. She had found him, and somewhere along the way found herself again too. The weekend dawned soft and clear, sunlight spilling over the castle like a benediction. The thaw had deepened overnight, and the air outside smelled of rain and earth instead of frost. Hermione dressed in quiet anticipation, pulling on a wool cloak and winding a scarf around her neck. Her reflection in the mirror looked unusually restless. Cheeks flushed, curls wild despite her best efforts. She tried to ignore it. It wasn't a date, after all. Draco had merely offered to walk her to Hogsmeade. Friends, if that was what they were, did that sort of thing all the time. Yet the thought of seeing him set her pulse racing in a way that logic refused to soothe. By the time she reached the castle steps, Draco was already waiting. He wore his cloak half unbuttoned, the morning wind tugging faintly at the fabric. The color suited him, a dark green that made the silver in his eyes gleam all the brighter. "You're punctual," she said, trying to sound casual. He gave a small, amused smile. "You're surprised?" "Not surprised," she said, "just impressed." He offered his arm in a mock display of courtesy. "Shall we then, before I lose my newfound reputation for reliability?" Hermione looped her arm through his, the gesture both strange and natural. Together, they set off down the sloping path that wound toward Hogsmeade. The sky was a pale blue, streaked with thin clouds, and the world smelled clean, new. For a time, they walked in silence, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the quiet rush of wind through the trees. "It's strange," Draco said at last, breaking the stillness. "Coming back here like this. I used to hate this path." "Hate it?" He nodded. "It reminded me too much of things I didn't have. Freedom, friends, the normal sort of life everyone else seemed to enjoy." Hermione glanced at him, her expression soft. "And now?" "Now," he said slowly. "It feels different, lighter somehow." "Maybe because you've changed," she said gently. He chuckled. "Or maybe because you're here." Hermione turned her face away quickly, though she felt the warmth rise in her cheeks. When they reached the edge of the village, the air filled with the scent of butterbeer and honey from honeydukes. Shops gleamed under the sunlight, their windows crowded with displays of chocolate frogs, enchanted quills, and trinkets that sparkled like captured stars. Students milled through the streets, laughing, their voices echoing off the cobblestones. Draco looked slightly out of place among the noise and colour, though Hermione noticed he didn't seem uncomfortable, only thoughtful, as if seeing the place through new eyes. "Let's get a drink," she suggested, nodding toward the 3 broomsticks. He hesitated, then smiled. "Lead the way." The inn was warm and alive, the air thick with chatter and the clink of mugs. Madame Rosmerta waved them toward a small table near the window, and Hermione ordered 2 butterbeers. When the drinks arrived, she wrapped her hands around the mug, savouring the warmth that seeped into her fingers. Draco studied the room with quiet curiosity. "I never came here much," he said. "My father thought places like this were beneath our family." Hermione raised an eyebrow. "You missed out," he smirked. "So it seems." They fell into easy conversation. Hermione told him about her work at the Ministry, her plans to reform outdated magical laws. Draco listened intently, occasionally asking sharp, perceptive questions. In turn, he spoke of his own quiet ambitions, to rebuild the Malfoy estate, not as a fortress of pride, but as a sanctuary of peace for his mother, who had suffered more than she ever admitted. "I think she's finally starting to breathe again," he said softly. "I'm glad," Hermione said. "She deserves that." "So do you," he replied. Hermione blinked, startled. "Me?" He nodded, his expression earnest. "You've carried too much for too long, Granger. The world owes you more than medals and speeches." His words caught her off guard. No one had ever said it quite like that. Not Harry, not Ron, not anyone. For a moment, she couldn't speak. "Maybe I don't need the world to owe me anything," she said finally. "Maybe it's enough just to see things change." Draco smiled faintly. "You always did chase impossible things." "Someone has to," she said with quiet conviction. The conversation drifted after that, lighter now, filled with easy laughter and the occasional teasing remark. When they left the 3 broomsticks, the sun was lower, painting the streets in warm gold. They wandered past the shops, pausing to admire the window of Scriven Shaft's quill shop, where a feather pen dipped itself endlessly in an invisible pot of ink. Hermione found herself glancing at Draco more than once. He looked almost at ease, the tension that had once haunted his every movement now softened by the calm of the afternoon. It was strange, she thought, how someone she had once despised could now feel so familiar, so quietly necessary. As they reached the edge of the village, he spoke again. "Do you remember the first day of our project?" She laughed softly. How could I forget? You were impossible. I wasn't the only one, he said dryly. You practically declared war over a quill. I did not. He gave her a sidelong glance. You did, but you also made tea. The memory made her smile. I suppose I did. They paused by the old stone bridge that crossed the stream. The water below caught the light like molten glass, and for a moment the world felt utterly still. Hermione, Draco said quietly. She turned to him, her pulse quickening at the sound of her name. He looked uncertain for the first time that day. There's something I need to say before I lose the courage to say it. Her heart thudded. Go on. He drew a slow breath. I meant what I said before. You've changed me. And I don't mean in the simple, sentimental way people talk about redemption. I mean, you made me want to be better, not because I should, but because I finally want to. Hermione felt her throat tighten. Draco. He stepped closer. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. But she did say something. She reached out, her hand finding his. You don't have to try so hard anymore. You already are better. His fingers tightened around hers, and for a long moment they stood like that, sunlight wrapping them in quiet warmth. Do you think, he said softly, that people like us can ever really begin again? Hermione smiled. We already have. He looked at her then, eyes shining with something both fierce and fragile. And before she could think, before doubt could weave its spell, he kissed her again, deeper this time, sure and unhurried. The world around them blurred, fading into the sound of wind and water and the distant hum of life. When they parted, she was smiling through the tears she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. 10 days, she whispered. That was all it took to change everything. Draco brushed a stray curl from her face, his voice barely a murmur. 10 days to win me. A lifetime, perhaps, to understand how. And as they turned back toward the castle, hand in hand beneath the gilded sky, the weight of the past seemed, at last, to loosen its hold, leaving behind only the fragile, wondrous promise of what might come next. The days that followed unfolded like a dream she was almost afraid to wake from. Spring had come in earnest now, the trees unfurling new leaves, the air scented with rain and grass. The sunlight poured through the castle's high windows, painting everything in gold. For the first time in what felt like years, Hermione moved through her days without that faint, lingering weight on her chest. It wasn't that her responsibilities had lessened. She still buried herself in books and causes, still fought for every scrap of fairness she believed in. But the burden no longer felt hers to carry alone. Draco had become her quiet constant. They met in the library most evenings, no longer out of obligation, but because it felt wrong not to. Sometimes they studied, parchments scattered between them in neat, deliberate piles. Other times they simply sat in silence, the kind that spoke louder than any conversation. If someone had told her a year ago that she would find comfort in Draco Malfoy's company, she would have laughed, perhaps hexed them for good measure. But now, watching the way his eyes softened when he listened, or the way his laughter slipped free like sunlight breaking through clouds, she couldn't deny it. He had become something she hadn't known she needed. One evening, as twilight gathered beyond the windows, Draco closed the book he'd been pretending to read and said, "You're quiet tonight." Hermione looked up from her parchment. "I was thinking." "That's hardly unusual." She gave a small, exasperated laugh. I mean, really thinking. About what? She hesitated. About what happens next. He raised an eyebrow. You mean after Hogwarts? She nodded. It's strange. For years, everything I did, everything any of us did, was about survival. Now that the war's over, there's space for more. But sometimes I don't know who I'm supposed to be in that space. Draco leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. You'll figure it out. You always do. I wish I had your certainty. He smiled faintly. You mistake faith for certainty. They're not the same thing. His words caught her off guard. There was wisdom in them, the quiet kind that came from loss and endurance. She studied him for a moment, realizing again how much he had changed. What about you? She asked softly. What do you want to do? He looked toward the window, where the last light of day glimmered against the glass. I don't know yet. Maybe something that helps rebuild what I helped destroy. Maybe I'll start small. Learn how to live without expecting the worst from everyone. That sounds like a start. He glanced at her then, his expression softening. It's easier when you're around. Hermione felt warmth rise in her cheeks. You're getting far too good at saying things like that. He smirked faintly. Practice. They shared a smile, and for a moment the room felt alive with something fragile and bright. Outside, the sky deepened to indigo. Lanterns flickered to life along the castle walls, casting ripples of gold across the ancient stone. It was late when they finally packed up their books. As they walked toward the common halls, the silence between them felt charged with all the things left unsaid. At the staircase that split toward Gryffindor Tower and the dungeons, they paused. Good night, Hermione, he said, his voice low. She hesitated. Draco, wait. He turned, and before she could think better of it, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was not their first kiss, but it was different, steadier, full of all the meaning they had been too careful to speak. His hand came to rest at the back of her neck, his fingers threading through her hair. When they parted, he looked at her as though she were something precious he hadn't believed he'd ever be allowed to hold. I think, he said quietly, that I was waiting for that all night. Hermione smiled, her heart racing. You could have said something. Where would be the fun in that? She laughed softly, shaking her head. Good night, Draco. He touched her cheek once more before stepping away. Good night, Granger. The next morning brought whispers. Hogwarts had always thrived on rumors, and by breakfast the castle was buzzing with them. Is it true? Ginny demanded as soon as Hermione sat down beside her. You and Malfoy? Hermione froze, her toast halfway to her plate. Where on earth did you hear that? Everywhere, Ginny said gleefully. Seamus swears he saw you in the corridor last night, and he's got witnesses. Hermione groaned. Brilliant, just what I needed. Harry, sitting across from her, looked at her over the top of his teacup. Is it true? She hesitated. It's complicated. Complicated, Ron repeated, his fork clattering onto his plate. Hermione, it's Malfoy. Hermione met his gaze evenly. Yes, it is, and he's not who he was. Ron looked ready to argue, but Harry placed a hand on his arm. Leave it, he said quietly. If Hermione says he's changed, he has. Hermione shot him a grateful look. Thank you. Don't thank me, Harry said with a faint smile. Just make sure he deserves you. I already know he does. The words surprised even her as they left her lips, but they felt true. Later that day, she found Draco waiting by the lake again, hands in his pockets, his expression calm despite the faint chaos that had erupted across the castle. "So," he said when she approached, "we're the talk of Hogwarts." Hermione sighed. "You heard." "Zabini nearly choked on his pumpkin juice this morning," he said dryly. "Apparently my reputation has been ruined beyond repair." "You'll survive," she teased. "Will I?" His lips curved. "You might have doomed me to eternal interest in social niceties." "Oh, the horror." Draco laughed, the sound easy and unguarded. "It's not so bad, really." They sat together on the stone ledge overlooking the water. The sun glittered on the lake's surface, and the air was cool but gentle. For a while, they said nothing. "I used to think happiness was something other people invented," Draco said after a long pause. "Something that didn't belong to me." "And now?" Hermione asked. He looked at her, eyes bright in the sunlight. "Now, I think it might have just been waiting for the right person to teach me what it meant." Hermione's breath caught. She wanted to speak, but words seemed inadequate. So instead, she took his hand. Their fingers fit together as though they had always been meant to. In the distance, the bells of the castle rang, marking the hour. The sound carried across the water, soft and sure. When Hermione looked back at Draco, she saw not the boy she had once despised, but the man he was becoming, a man who had faced his darkness and chosen light, one cautious step at a time. And for the first time since the war, she allowed herself to believe that the future, whatever it held, could be kind. They sat until the sun sank behind the trees, painting the sky in hues of rose and silver. Neither spoke again. There was no need. The world, at last, felt quiet enough to simply be. The term drifted toward its end like a long exhale. The snow had vanished completely now, leaving behind emerald hills and the distant shimmer of the lake beneath the spring sun. Wildflowers bloomed along the edges of the forbidden forest, and owls flew higher in the warming air, their wings flashing silver and brown. The castle hummed with the gentle chaos of a school preparing to part for summer. Yet for Hermione and Draco, the passing days carried a different kind of weight. The quiet, certain knowing that something rare had begun between them. It had been weeks since their secret had become public, and though whispers still chased them through corridors, they had long stopped caring. Hermione walked beside Draco openly now, her hands sometimes brushing his as they climbed the marble staircases or crossed the courtyard. She no longer tried to explain it to anyone. For all her fondness for logic, this was something beyond the reach of reason, a fragile truth that lived not in words, but in the space between them. On a bright morning near the end of term, Hermione sat on the grass near the lake, parchment in her lap, the wind tugging playfully at her curls. She was writing to her parents, telling them about the year, about her plans for the summer, about the strange peace that had finally begun to settle in her heart. She hesitated before adding Draco's name, then smiled faintly and did so anyway. A shadow fell across the page. "You look far too serious for someone sitting in sunlight," Draco said, settling beside her. "I'm writing," she said, glancing up at him. "It requires focus." "Focus?" He leaned slightly closer, his voice teasing. "You, Granger, are the only person I know who can turn a letter into an academic exercise." She smirked. "And you, Malfoy, are the only person I know who can make an interruption sound like flattery." He laughed softly and stretched out on the grass beside her, folding his arms behind his head. "I'll take that as a compliment." The wind rippled across the lake, scattering sunlight in brilliant shards. For a while, they were silent. Hermione put down her quill, letting the breeze play across the parchment. "It's hard to believe it's ending," she said quietly. He turned his head toward her. "Hogwarts," she nodded. "This year, everything that's happened. Sometimes I still wake up expecting to fight, to argue, to prove myself again. And then I remember that the war's over. It feels strange not to have a battle waiting." Draco's voice was low. "You fought long enough for a dozen lifetimes." She looked at him, smiling faintly. "So did you." "Not like you," he said. "I ran. I hid. I survived. That's not the same." "It's enough," she said firmly. "Surviving can be brave too." He didn't answer right away. The lake reflected the clouds above, and for a moment it seemed he was studying his own reflection in its depths. "I used to think my family's name was all I had," he said at last. "Then the war stripped it away, and I didn't know who I was without it. But lately—" He hesitated, his gaze flicking toward her. "Lately, I think I'm starting to find out." Hermione's heart softened. "Who are you then?" His lips curved into a small, honest smile. "Someone who doesn't want to lose you." The words hung between them like a spell too fragile to break. Hermione set her parchment aside, reaching out to take his hand. "Then don't." He laced his fingers through hers, holding on as if to anchor himself. "It's not that simple." "It can be," she said quietly, "if we let it." They sat that way for a long time, watching the water shift and shimmer beneath the afternoon sun. Around them, laughter drifted from the castle, students chasing their last hours of freedom before the train would carry them all back to the world beyond these walls. Yet here, at the edge of the lake, it felt as though time had paused just for them. When the shadows grew long and the bells of the castle chimed 6, Hermione stood and brushed grass from her robes. "Walk with me." Draco rose beside her, offering a hand as though it were the most natural thing in the world. They strolled along the shoreline, their steps falling into easy rhythm. "Do you think we'll still see each other after this?" she asked softly. He looked amused. "You doubt it?" "I don't want to," she admitted. "But I've learned that life has a way of pulling people in different directions." He stopped, turning to face her. The light caught his hair, gilding it in pale gold. "Then I'll just have to make sure our directions stay the same." Hermione laughed. "And how do you plan to do that exactly?" "Charm," he said, deadpan, "and relentless persistence." She rolled her eyes, smiling. "Well, you've got one of those." He tilted his head. "Which one?" "I'll let you guess." He grinned, and the sight of it, the warmth, the ease, the unguarded joy, sent a ripple of quiet wonder through her. As they reached the foot of the castle steps, Draco slowed, his hand still holding hers. "Do you remember what you said that first day?" he asked. "That you wanted to make our project unforgettable?" Hermione smiled. "I suppose I did." "Well," he said, his eyes glinting with something like mischief, "you succeeded." She shook her head, laughing softly. "It wasn't supposed to turn out like this." "Most worthwhile things never do," he murmured. He leaned down then, and she met him halfway. Their kiss was unhurried, familiar now, filled with the quiet certainty of something real. The world seemed to hush around them. The rustle of wind, the cry of distant owls, even the heartbeat of the castle itself. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "What happens now?" Draco smiled faintly. "Whatever we choose." The answer felt right. That evening, as twilight gathered over Hogwarts, Hermione stood at her dormitory window, gazing out at the castle grounds. The lake shimmered in the distance, and beyond it, the forest whispered with secrets older than time. She could see two figures, tiny from here, walking along the water's edge, hand in hand. Ginny joined her, leaning against the frame. "You look happy," she said simply. "I am," Hermione admitted. Ginny grinned. "About time." Hermione didn't argue. She watched until the figures vanished from sight, her heart light and full. In the days that followed, the castle would empty. Trains would carry them all back to their separate worlds, and life would resume its familiar rhythm. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The girl who had once lived by logic and plans had found, at last, the courage to follow something uncertain and true. And somewhere in that vast, unpredictable world, a boy who had once hidden behind pride and shame had learned how to begin again. 10 days had started it. 10 days that had been meant as a jest, a challenge, a foolish game. But love, like magic, often worked best when least expected. When Hermione stepped onto the train a week later, she looked back at the castle one last time. Sunlight glinted off its towers, and in the reflection of the window, she caught a glimpse of herself smiling. A quiet, knowing smile that spoke of endings and beginnings intertwined. The whistle blew, the train shuddered forward, and the world began to move again. But even as the hills rolled past and Hogwarts faded from view, she felt it still. The echo of a voice, the warmth of a hand, and the memory of a promise whispered beneath the falling stars. "Whatever we choose."